Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast series on industry and market analysis, an initiative brought to you by marketresearchreports.com. In this series, our hosts, Mike and Samantha, discuss key aspects of selected topics, providing valuable insights tailored for business professionals and decision makers. For those with limited time to navigate countless articles and videos, they'll do the legwork for you, delivering concise and actionable information. Let's get started.
The flashier parts of the global economy. But maybe we should spend a moment on something absolutely fundamental, the agrochemical industry.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook, but it's basically the bedrock supporting our whole food system.
Exactly. And right now, it's going through some really profound changes.
Yeah.
Big shifts in how key things like fertilizers and pesticides are sourced, how they're distributed. And these changes, well, they affect everyone, really.
Absolutely. And to really understand what's happening, we've been digging into this fantastic 4-part analysis from marketresearchreports.com.
Oh, yes.
This final part really focuses in on these realignments happening in the global agrochemical supply chain, specifically looking at 2023, 2024, and kind of peering into the future.
Right, and it builds on their earlier work, doesn't it? They looked at the market structure, the trade picture from 21 to 24, and the impact of trade wars and tariffs. So this piece really ties it all together.
It does. It provides that essential context for what we're seeing now.
So think of this as your express lane to getting up to speed on these critical shifts. Our aim here is to pull out the key insights from this final marketresearchreports.com report.
Yeah, make sense of these, frankly, complex changes, what's driving them, what they actually mean on the ground.
But without getting totally bogged down in, excessive detail. So whether you need this for work or you're just curious, we want to make it efficient to grasp the essentials.
And what really stands out from the report is how interconnected everything is. You've got geopolitics like the Russia-Ukraine war bumping up against trade policies, market swings. It's all feeding into these changes.
Okay, so let's start there. The report talks about a dramatic reshaping of fertilizer trade.
Yeah, that's a good place to begin. The upheaval really kicked off with the war in 2022.
Right. You had sanctions hitting Belarus, a huge potash exporter, and then just this general caution around buying Russian products. It really threw the old supply lines into disarray, didn't it?
It really did. It's quite sobering when you think about how a conflict in one region can so quickly impact something as basic as, well, growing food globally. But what's also really interesting, and the report highlights this, is how adaptable some of the big players were. Or perhaps resilient?
So?
Well, take Russia. You might expect their exports to plummet, but they actually managed to increase their overall fertilizer exports in 2023, that's excluding ammonia, mainly by redirecting shipments towards Asia.
Really? Increase?
Yeah. Their share of the world's potash exports jumped up to about 20%. Meanwhile, Belarus, under sanctions, saw its share basically cut in half.
Wow. So it shows how quickly these major commodity players can pivot, even under pressure.
Exactly. Sanctions might disrupt, but they don't always stop trade entirely. Sometimes they just reroute it. New partnerships form, trade lanes shift.
Okay, and then there's China, another massive player, obviously. And they made a pretty big move, too, didn't they? Restricting their own exports.
Yes, that was significant. The report points to some really sharp drops, particularly in the first half of 2024 compared to the first half of 23. We're talking like a 60% plunge in phosphate exports.
60%.
And urea was even more dramatic, down something like 90%.
90? Goodness. What does that tell us? About China's priorities, I mean.
Well, the report suggests it was very much about protecting their domestic market, ensuring supply at home.
Okay.
But the combined effect of that, plus the issues with Belarus, it put huge pressure on importing countries, especially in Europe. They basically had to scramble for new suppliers.
Which is where others stepped in.
Precisely. We saw importers turn increasingly to places like Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., Canada. It's a classic example of supply chain diversification happening really fast, out of necessity.
So the whole global map for fertilizers has kind of been redrawn then. Russia and Belarus still exporting potash, but using different routes, maybe more towards China and India.
That's right. And the report notes how India and Brazil, for instance, really increased their imports of Russian potash, possibly getting it at a discount. India's share went from just 4% in 2021 to nearly 29% in 2023.
29%.
And Brazil saw a bump too. Interestingly, Canada initially gained some market share in 2022, but then it slipped back a bit in 23 as those Russian volumes found their new homes.
Fascinating. And it wasn't just about rerouting existing supply, was it? New production came online too.
Yes, that's another key point in the report. New nitrogen fertilizer capacity started up in places like Nigeria, Egypt, and the U.S. Their urea exports jumped by about 50% in 2023 compared to the 2021 average.
50%. Wow.
Meanwhile, Russia's share in the nitrogen trade actually fell a bit, likely due to logistical issues, getting ammonia out. So, yeah, a much more dynamic picture overall.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit to pesticides. The report says global trade actually contracted in 2023 after a big surge before that.
Yeah, that's right. About a 13% drop year on year in export value, a noticeable pullback.
Why was that?
Well, it reflects the market cycle. Prices had been really high, so major exporters saw revenues fall as those prices started to, retreat from the peaks.
But China, still the biggest exporter, felt that too.
Oh, yes. Even though they held the top spot, their pesticide exports tumbled by 27% in 2023. The report puts that down mainly to just, sluggish global demand.
And it wasn't just China, right? Others saw declines too.
No, definitely not. India, the U.S., other big suppliers, they also saw double-digit drops. India was down about 22%, although that was after a record high the previous year. The U.S. also saw a significant fall.
And the reason for that sluggish demand?
Seems to be largely down to destocking, as the report calls it.
Destocking.
Yeah. Basically, buyers had built up really large inventories back when supply chains were chaotic and prices were soaring. They were hedging against disruptions. So in 2023, they started using up those stockpiles before placing big new orders, hence the drop in trade.
Makes sense. But the report also mentions India's rise in this sector, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even with that dip in 23.
It absolutely does. That's a really important underlying trend. By 2022, India had actually become the world's second largest agrochemical exporter.
Overtaking the U.S.
Yes, particularly as a supplier of generic or post-patent products. So even though 2023 saw a dip for everyone, India's position as a major global player was, pretty well cemented.
Okay, let's talk about those price swings you mentioned. The report describes it as a real roller coaster for fertilizers.
It really was. Historic highs in 2022, followed by these steep declines in 2023.
How steep are we talking?
Well, the World Bank's fertilizer price index was down about 17% year on year by late 2024. And a sort of composite basket of fertilizer prices was roughly half what it was at its peak in September 2022.
Half.
Yeah, think about urea. It went from maybe $800 a ton down to under $300. Potash fell from over $700 to the low $200 by late 2024. Huge swings.
So for anyone involved in farming or agricultural investment, that kind of volatility must be incredibly difficult to manage.
Definitely represents both risks and maybe opportunities. What's interesting is why the prices fell so much.
What does the report say?
It points to a couple things. One was demand destruction. Those super high prices in 2022 meant farmers simply used less fertilizer.
Right, they cut back.
And then on the supply side, things started to recover somewhat. New sources came online, as we discussed. So less demand meeting recovering supply, prices came down.
But not all the way back down to pre-pandemic levels?
No, generally not. The report notes that prices, while lower, often stayed above those earlier norms. Demand did start to recover, and you still had those export restrictions, like China's, keeping some supply off the market.
And is the volatility over now?
Probably not completely. The report mentions things like natural gas prices, a key cost for nitrogen fertilizers. Fluctuations there could still cause price ripples.
Okay. And pesticides saw similar swings.
Yes, a similar pattern. Glyphosate is a good example. Mentioned in the analysis hit decade highs, and the price just collapsed. Import demand for it apparently plunged by 80% by mid-2023.
80%.
Yeah. So overall, 2023 brought some relief on input costs compared to the craziness of 2022, but there's still this sense of lingering market uncertainty.
Which logically leads to thinking about where the stuff is actually made, right? Shifts in production and supply sources.
Exactly. And the report really highlights diversification as the key trend here for 2023-24.
Where's it done by?
Well, in Europe, those really high natural gas prices we mentioned, plus evolving trade barriers, really forced some changes in fertilizer production.
How so?
European ammonia output was sharply curtailed. Big companies like Yara had to idle significant capacity, at least temporarily.
But that created openings elsewhere.
It did.
Yeah.
It was an opportunity for producers in places with cheaper energy or fewer restrictions like the U.S., the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Asia. They ramped up production, ramped up exports.
Any specific examples?
Well, the report mentions Nigeria's Dangote urea plant hitting full capacity. That contributed to that big jump around 50% in Nigeria's urea exports we talked about earlier.
Oh,
And in phosphates, Morocco's OCP really capitalized. They have huge reserves, they've invested heavily, so they were well positioned to expand output and exports.
and China's role here. We said they restricted exports, but are they shifting production too?
It's interesting. Their role as a direct supplier definitely diminished because of the export curbs. But the report notes that Chinese companies are now starting to invest in production abroad. So shifting their strategy, perhaps.
Adding another layer of complexity.
Definitely. And we already touched on India's major expansion in pesticide production capacity. They really established themselves as a global manufacturing hub.
Meeting demand from places looking to diversify away from China.
Precisely. Like Latin America and North America, Indian companies stepped in to meet that rising demand. Even the big Western multinationals, Bayer, BASF, Syngenta, Corteva, they had to adjust their own supply chains.
How did they fare?
It was mixed, according to the analysis. Some maybe benefited from shortages of Chinese generics, but they also faced higher raw material costs themselves sometimes.
So the net effect is a more spread out production landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary for 2023. More distributed, more diversified than it was before.
Now, we can't talk about these shifts without talking about government policies and tariffs. The report says they had an outsized impact in 2023-24.
A huge impact. They've become incredibly important drivers. Think about export controls, China's ongoing quotas and bans, especially on urea and phosphates.
Right.
And Russia implementing a 10% export duty on its fertilizers, signaling an end to, maybe some of those heavily discounted deals. These directly shape where products flow and at what price.
And on the import side, tariffs seem key there.
Absolutely. Western countries debating and in some cases implementing new tariffs targeting Russia and Belarus. The EU's proposed steep tariffs potentially hitting 100% eventually are a big deal.
Especially since EU imports from Russia had actually surged recently.
Exactly. The report mentions a 117% surge between 2021 and 2023-24, which clearly raised strategic concerns in Brussels, leading to these proposed tariffs.
And the U.S. already had tariffs in place on some products.
Yes, existing tariffs on phosphate from Morocco and Russia, plus tariffs on... There was some lobbying in 2023 to get waivers for certain duties.
It's so complex. Are there other policy shifts mentioned?
Yeah, the report touches on things like India significantly increasing its fertilizer subsidies, nearly $24 billion in 2022-23, and actively pursuing bilateral deals to lock in supplies.
Securing their own needs.
Right. And then there's the environmental angle. Regulations, especially pesticide bans or restrictions in places like Europe, are also reshaping trade, pushing demand towards newer, maybe lower toxicity products.
So it's not just market forces anymore.
Not at all. The report makes it clear. Government policies are now absolutely central, sometimes even overriding the traditional supply and demand signals in the agrochemical market.
Okay, to really hammer home how widespread these changes are, the marketresearchreports.com analysis gives a quick regional rundown. Let's maybe touch on the key takeaways for a few. Europe, for instance.
Right. Europe, hit hard by supply disruptions, saw its reliance on Russian fertilizer bounce back despite the political worries, and now it's actively pursuing strategies, tariffs, things like green ammonia development to try and gain more autonomy.
Makes sense. North America, the U.S. specifically.
Initially saw some benefits, maybe, but farmers ended up paying higher costs. They shifted import sources more from Canada, Qatar, Egypt, Nigeria. Also diversifying pesticide supply, bringing in more from India and looking to boost their own domestic production capacity.
And India, we've mentioned them a few times, clearly emerges as a key player.
Oh, definitely. A big winner in some ways. Secured those discounted Russian fertilizers, ramped up their own urea production, made that huge leap in pesticide exports we discussed, really solidified its position as a global hub for post-patent agrochemicals.
What about Southeast Asia? They must have felt China's export ban keenly.
Very much so. Faced price spikes, had to hunt for alternative suppliers like the Middle East and Russia. Interestingly, the report notes Chinese firms are actually investing in Southeast Asia now, maybe to secure market access, and there's a push within the region for more self-sufficiency.
Australia and New Zealand. down under.
They got a real shock from the price hikes. It exposed how much they relied on China. They had to make quite dramatic shifts in where they got phosphates, and now they're looking more seriously at domestic production options and building up supply buffers, also promoting more biopesticides.
And Latin America.
Yeah.
Brazil, Argentina.
Heavily impacted, yeah. They had to diversify fertilizer imports very quickly, more from Canada, Morocco, Egypt, even Iran. They also increased pesticide imports from India, and there's a renewed push for more local fertilizer production.
So it really touches everywhere.
Absolutely. The regional breakdown just confirms how globally interconnected these realignments are. No region was untouched.
Okay, finally, the report looks at how the big agrochemical companies themselves responded strategically to all this volatility.
Right. It wasn't just governments reacting. Companies made significant moves. We saw capacity expansions, new plants being built for both fertilizers and crop protection.
Investing in future supply.
Exactly. Also, a noticeable increase in joint ventures and partnerships. Chinese firms setting up JVs overseas, closer ties maybe between Russia and China on fertilizers, Indian companies doing deals to secure raw materials.
Any mergers and acquisitions?
Some, yes. The report suggests mostly smaller deals, often aimed at vertical integration, controlling more of the supply chain, or just gaining access to specific markets.
And what about innovation? Did that play a role?
A significant one. There's a growing emphasis on developing alternative products. Things like green ammonia made using renewable energy, biofertilizers, biopesticides driven partly by regulation, but also by the desire for more resilient and maybe sustainable inputs.
So the industry is shifting from just crisis management to actually trying to build long-term resilience and maybe even seize some new opportunities created by all this disruption.
Right.
That's the sense you get from the analysis. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Summing up our deep dive into this marketresearchreports.com analysis, we've definitely seen major realignments in the global agrochemical supply chain.
Yeah, driven by that complex mix, geopolitics, trade policies, sheer market volatility.
And the key themes that emerge seem to be this strong push towards diversifying sources, a real focus on security of supply.
And these strategic responses, these adjustments, coming from both national governments and the big corporate players.
Which leads to maybe a final thought, something for our listeners to chew on. What are the really long-term implications of all these shifts?
That's the big question, isn't it? How does this affect global food security down the line? How does it change the balance of power and who controls these essential agricultural inputs?
And how do these economic, political, and environmental factors keep interacting to shape this critical industry?
Exactly. The report suggests these might not just be temporary fixes. We could be seeing the foundations of a genuinely new global agrochemical order being laid right now.
Definitely food for thought. And for listeners who want to explore this further, get the premium reports, the detailed data, the full in-depth analysis.
Of the agrochemical sector, related industries.
The place to go is marketresearchreports.com.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and found it valuable for enhancing your knowledge and understanding. Don't forget to browse our website, marketresearchreports.com, where you'll find tens of thousands of research reports spanning various industries. These insights are designed to empower decision makers and help you stay ahead of the competition.